Welcome to our next lecture for BAAS 3020, Fundamentals of Inquiry and Discovery. Specifically, welcome to the lecture on Module 8, Ethical Issues in Research. Continuing my little personal journey here, since I don't really get to meet you in class, this is a picture of me on the Camino Santiago in Spain. I think I've mentioned this in previous lectures. And this is the first journey I ever went on, and as far as a hiking, a long epic hike, and this was a month-long walk where I literally walked across the country of Spain. And stepping outside of your life is a very powerful thing, but even more so, this was something on my bucket list. I had read a book by an author named Paulo Coelho called The Alchemist. Loved it, and then read another book that he wrote on the Camino, and for some reason I'm just drawing a blank now what the title of that book is. But he wrote a fictional book about walking the Camino Santiago, which is this path across Spain, supported by the Catholic Church. It's very inexpensive because there's all these cheap places to stay for pilgrims or hikers that walk on this path, and you can even see quite a few, or at least several, in this pathway, this picture you see here. And it was just a great journey. It was difficult physically at first, but then I realized, I thought it was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it's just walking. And one of the quick things you learn is that if you walk every day for a number of hours, that by the end of the week, you're pretty strong, and it's amazing that how that changes. The other thing I realized is when I found it really difficult, it actually became one of the easiest things to do, because in our lives, there's always all these things to do. You're balancing all your to-do lists, etc. And out on the Camino, you really only have two decisions. Because the pathway is so well marked, you only have two thoughts. When do I eat? And when do I stop and eat? When do I stop and sleep? And so it was incredibly freeing, probably one of the best vacations I ever had. Certainly it is one of the best vacations and adventures I've ever had. Okay, let's move on. In Module 8, we're going to be looking at Chapters 6 and 7 in our textbook Curious. In Canvas, you're going to find a number of pages with information, glossary on ethical issues, an overview of these, some talk about voluntary participation, no harm to participants, some more ethical issues we're going to look at, IRB proposals. Additional materials include 4 really cool videos: the Belmont Report, Ethical Riddles in HIV Research. This is a TED Talk. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, a very interesting overview of that. These are all really short videos. And then don't miss for sure the Stanford Prison Experiment. Actually, don't miss any of those. They're really good. In this module, you also have a module quiz. And then the only other assignment is not even something you turn in, but it's to go ahead and review survey parts E and F so that you begin planning. Okay, there's nothing due yet, but you need to begin planning. You need to see where your survey project is headed. Our text reading for this module comes from Chapter 6 in Curious, The Power of Questions, which just does a great job of kind of giving us a broad swipe at looking at questioning in childhood, questioning across social strata, questioning in the workplace, and even in society, and how the lack of questioning leads to disaster. So just some, again, a pretty short read, maybe about a half an hour, and some interesting insights and lots of good examples. First was looking at a counselor who was working in a disadvantaged school, trying to help kids stay in school and enrolled, and he recognized that the parents were having difficulty in the parent-teacher meetings, and that they would go to them, they would listen attentively, and then they would leave, but nothing would change. And he kind of discovered that they didn't really have the skills for questioning. And he realized that the teaching of question asking had the power to change lives. And he first started giving them questions, and then when he actually taught them how to ask questions, open-ended versus closed-ended, and taught them the skill, that they and their own children did much better. A 1930 study cited here suggested that upper class children asked more questions than lower class children. 1984 kind of proposed the same, that the proportion of conversations that turned on questions asked by a child was greater in the middle class families over working class ones. They found this wasn't because necessarily the moms weren't answering the questions, but that middle class mothers were asking more questions of the children. And the idea here is that question asking is contagious. If you're doing it to your kid, then your kid's going to turn around and ask more of those questions or feel more confident about asking those questions. In 2011 study, they suggested that open-ended, intellectually inviting questions are what you have time for after you're done with the business of survival. And so it was another suggestion, or maybe a potential explanation of why, as you move up in the social classes, your children may perform better in school and work, etc., because you aren't potentially as worried about your day-to-day survival as you may be at a lower economic class. Different styles of parenting also led to different levels of ability and success in the modern world. And it talks about concerted cultivation versus natural growth. And these are the styles that they were suggesting for each of the different classes. I like how they were talking about not having a lot of judgment about which is better. They were just kind of reporting on them. That middle class, because of this concerted cultivation, were more adept at maximizing opportunities that come their way or bending situations and structures to their own will, where it indicated that the working class folks just didn't have the same kind of skill sets or knew what questions to ask, or just didn't have the chutzpah or the ability to impose themselves on organizations outside of their own family structure. So they didn't have that, maybe the confidence or the skill at asking the right questions to kind of engage people in organizations, whether they were, social service type things or schools, etc. A really interesting part of this chapter was this concept that a failure to ask questions is often the root cause of disasters. And they cite a couple examples from the Titanic and Iraq War and found that quite fascinating. And then intentionally choosing or cultivating ignorance is this phenomenon as an that the author was suggesting that as an organization grows and gets bigger and bigger, that they stop asking questions. Senior managers are getting their bonuses, and so they don't want to rock the boat, so to speak. Questions are the best weapons of the weak against the strong, but only because the strong unilaterally disarm. And these two last thoughts go exactly together. Our next chapter in Curious, chapter 7, the importance of knowing. Another interesting chapter, and probably something that feels relatively familiar to most of us because we've been in school. And so the author, Leslie, kind of looks at what he considered as a flawed theory. Our schools are good at producing efficient administrators capable of running an empire, but less good at cultivating curious learners. Knowledge is obsolete. He uses a couple references for this, specifically the massive accessibility of the internet and all the knowledge that's easily reached. Maybe we no longer need to know facts, but we need to know how to use facts is one of the common theories. Should schools be places where adults transmit to children the academic knowledge that society deems valuable, or places where children are allowed to follow their own curiosity? Our education system is always being questioned and challenged, and certainly when we look at some of the performances, especially in more difficult social economic situations, it definitely warrants study. And so this is the debate that he's looking at, this idea that progressive education, which is about providing more learning skills, trying to nurture the natural curiosity of a child, how does it place alongside the more traditional knowledge-rich curriculum of teaching math, geology, history, etc.? And he falls on the side where he says the wider your knowledge, the more widely your intelligence can range, and the more purchase it gets on new information. suggesting that allowing children to be free-range chickens, so to speak, and pursue whatever they want is not necessarily going to feed their curiosity. That what makes our curiosity stronger is a database of knowledge that we have. That the more knowledge you have, the more it will feed your curiosity. You might think of that knowledge like the gasoline for curiosity, that if you don't have a little bit of knowledge about an area or some base knowledge, and I think we've seen this in this reading before, then you might not go any deeper because it just seems too much. And so that's what he's kind of proposing here again, that long-term memory is the source of much of our knowledge, and is the hidden power behind the throne of cognition. Now remember, that's the idea we had from the very beginning of this book, that curiosity is this ability of cognition. Knowledge gives curiosity staying power. It again is the fuel. It's a really interesting chapter to me, as an educator and as a parent as well. And looking at, I had two children that were very different styles, and my youngest child is probably what I would say is the most curious person I ever met, and just loved learning and hated school. And so I had some very strong feelings about this, which has made this chapter really curious and interesting for me. The best predictor of academic achievement was general knowledge, vocabulary, followed by fine motor function, and third was character traits such as self-control and motivation. And so this is interesting again. I think that a lot of what we're reading about progressive philosophies or educational practices are, that it's the soft skills that we need to support and engage in children to make them successful. When it comes to education, curiosity is in the odd position of being undervalued and overpraised at the same time. On the one hand, schools overemphasize performance and vocational preparation at the expense of instilling pleasure in learning. We get this. We hear this all the time, and I just kind of elaborated on some of that. A less obvious one is the assumption that a child's curiosity needs only to be unlocked for them to head off on amazing intellectual journeys of discovery. So a very interesting chapter. Again, if you're a parent, especially if you're a parent of a primary school kid, some interesting things to think about. So again, I like to have a little pause here, a quick shower or refresher for your brain. So again, you can hit pause here, stand up, take a walk outside, get a cookie, get a coffee, get a drink. Success is no accident. It is hard work, perseverance, learning, studying, sacrifice, and most of all, love of what you are doing or learning to do. Put your heart, mind, and soul into even your smallest acts. This is the secret of success. Failure is not the opposite of success, it's part of success. I love that last one. I think this is the one most people miss. They think if they drop the ball or fail at something that they're bad. You are going to fail. We're all going to fail again and again. And when you fail, it's not a bad thing as long as you learn from it. What can I do better? What is the goal in this? I know in my own life that sometimes my failures have been my best and greatest lessons because I paid more attention. I paid more attention and learned something. Our first Canvas material is, as it has been in many modules, a glossary of the terms associated with ethical issues. So page down through this, add it to your notes, make sure you understand all of the terms involved. Our next Canvas module, not module, excuse me, but content in this module is Ethics Issues Overview. Very brief but high-level view of ethics and ethics issues, some insight into specific organizations that focus on ethics and in research in general and in specific areas, and then just some really may seem common sense but not always common sense perspectives that you need to be thinking about as you design a survey and try to implement it. Next, we look at voluntary participation. Specifically, according to federal law, the most important thing for human studies is that we do not force or coerce people to participate. Um, this is a very short information piece and gives you some really um, concrete examples about why this became so important, about how this was actually abused. Um, there are some pretty difficult examples to read and hear here, but they're very short and they don't use a lot of graphics, etc. And I think it's important. I think it's important that you read through them and see what people have done without these kind of guidelines in place. Um, and I didn't write this section, but it's interesting that the author notes at the very bottom that many businesses still use coercion as part of their business model. That is, for if you don't agree to share your information, as in cookies or something on the internet, then you can't access their site or perhaps buy their products. Not so much, well, it could be harm, and so it's still an ethical question about whether a business should coerce you or not, or is it just something that they have control over because you have the option not to buy. An interesting study there what might be done. Our next content in Canvas focused on the concept of no harm to participants. Ideally, a study will never cause harm to a participant. But what has to be done is, you don't always recognize whether harm will be done or not. I mean, for example, even in a study about COVID pandemic, if someone suffered tremendous loss in their family of multiple members, any kind of survey may bring up some of that past trauma. So people need to be informed ahead of time about what sort of the study it is, why it's being done, and then agree to participate. And that's what is called informed consent. There's some good examples in here. Again, this is another short section, very clear about harm that's been done in some examples and the responses and how we now try to ensure ethical compliance in any kind of survey study. There's some good examples here that may not be readily apparent to you. So again, read through these carefully and include in your notes. Our next content focuses on additional ethical issues um, around the concept of anonymity and confidentiality, which we've looked at before in this new module. It also talks about deceptive deceit in some studies and gives some interesting examples. And again, not very long. And then it also gives a summary of the ethical issues to anticipate if you're actually doing a study. Read through, take good notes. This is a very short read. Our next section of content for this module looks at proposals for the Institutional Review Board. Remember that this is the body that you must submit a proposal to prior to your study, explaining why you're interested in something, what do you want to study, and ensuring that you're handling all the ethical issues and also potentially budget issues and other things as well. In this section, there's also an interview with Dr. Hughes from UNT about the types of research he does and the kind of issues he faces in his specific types of research. Very interesting and also very brief. Our final learning materials for this module are four very different and very interesting videos. The first is a researcher who's talking about the current situation or culture and environment that we live in and technology, etc., and some new challenges that the world we live in puts on ethical compliance or ethical considerations. And then there's a video that's talking about, the title is Ethical Riddles in HIV Research, and it's talking about how medical research is often done in developing countries, for a variety of reasons. One is the population of people infected by a disease may be greater there, but also that there are less rules and oversight for ethical research. And besides that, there are implications of what happens after the studies are done, and how that may cause more harm to folks who are in some ways coerced into these experiments because they don't have adequate medical treatment. Very interesting. There's an interesting video on the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. It kind of takes you through the whole history of it, some background on it, and then later history when it was overturned, and then even brought to light, and implications for even today. I mean, this experiment has been mentioned in the media recently in relation to the COVID pandemic, um, and people's resistance or reluctance to get the vaccine because of this endemic fear caused by situations like the Tuskegee experiment. And the last is the untold truth of the Stanford prison. There's also a link here for Netflix, or there's a longer documentary on Netflix. This is just a short overview. It's a very famous study. It's been looked at a number of times. And the setup is that at Stanford University, they created a prison scenario where some students were prison guards and some students were prisoners. The students were paid to do this. They were supposed to be in prison for 2 weeks, and the whole thing collapsed within 5 days. And what's interesting is even the professor who oversaw the experiment got caught up in it. There's controversy about whether this was valid or not as far as outtakes from it, but as recently as a decade or two ago with the Iraq War, where prisoners were grossly mistreated, the professor who did this experiment was actually asked to testify. So it's a very interesting video. So look at these. I think it'll give you some context for what we're studying in this module, and they're all kind of fascinating. They are to me anyway. So hopefully you enjoy that. In addition to your quiz module, which is really the only thing that's due out of this module this week, there's also a heads up that you should be looking forward to parts E and F of the survey project to help you in your planning with where we are right now with deliverables, okay? So you don't want to just keep only looking one step ahead. It's really a good idea to look at all of those parts of the survey project. But right now, it's very important that you review the steps that you need to take for the deliverables in part E and F, okay? So good luck in this module. Reach out whenever you need help or have questions.